All right, well, hopefully you found that video interesting, and there are a couple of things I'd like to retroactively attract your attention to. Did you notice that the children made mistakes on conjugating things like flied? The little boy was flying the plane, and he's like, I flied it, I sticked it. But they didn't make errors on words like said. Said is an irregular verb. If you conjugated it following normal rules, it would be said, but we say said. And one of the reasons why is children hear the word said a lot. That's not an unusual word for them. I said put it down. I said come here. I said it's time for bed. Right? How often do parents say that to their kids? So their whole lives, kids have been hearing said correctly conjugated. And so it's one of those words that very early on is correctly repeated by children. The ones that they make the errors on are the ones that they haven't heard as often, and they haven't had time to really internalize the correct pronunciation. What we're talking about here is what we call over-regularization, applying the rules of regular words to irregular words. It typically starts to emerge when kids have about 1,000 words in their vocabulary. So somewhere around age 2, 2.5, you'll start to hear kids over-regularizing words. And sometimes parents are dismayed by it. They're like, my child has backslid. They were speaking correctly, and now they're speaking incorrectly. I know for me, my daughter, when she was little, she correctly would say fell. And then one day she started saying, not only did she say falled, she said falded. And as a good cognitive psychologist, I was like, why would she say falded? Like, that's beyond the normal over-regularization rule. And it got me thinking that perhaps she realized at some level that this was one of those irregular words, and so she knew something different had to happen to it. And so she put two EDs as her something different, falded instead of fell, which she had been previously saying. And my husband's like, didn't she used to say fell? And I actually had her on videotape having said fell. And now she's saying falded. Well, it's a sign that she's actually advancing. It seems like a backslide, but it's a sign of advancement, that the child has actually gotten to the point where they know so many words that they just can't manage it as a memory for every single word. So now they're just going to apply the rule on the fly. It's going to take some more practice for them to get straight that the irregular verbs need to be remembered, right? The irregular superlatives need to be remembered. So this is a really important milestone when kids start making this error. It's actually a really good sign when they start to make this error. It means that you don't have to sit there and count their words anymore. They're probably at about 1,000 words of vocabulary. So really actually a good sign. So the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about with language is something else that is one of my subdivisions of expertise. I got my PhD in cognitive psychology and I minored in psycholinguistics. My research on psycholinguistics was all about the benefits of bilingualism, or the possible deficits. I did not find any of the deficits because I studied balanced bilinguals. And I'm saying bilingual because in the U.S. you're pretty lucky if you know two languages. But this would be, what I'm going to say is true whether you know two languages or you know more. It doesn't matter. Theoretically, children could acquire any number of languages and could do them all simultaneously and not have trouble with them, with certain constraints. What I would advise to any of you who are lucky enough to speak a language that's different than your mate is to adopt what we call the one parent, one language procedure, which is where one of you speaks one language exclusively to the child and the other one speaks the other language exclusively to the child. Sometimes, one of you knows both languages and one of you is the only one who knows the other language, and so it's really easy to decide who's going to do what. But if you both speak two languages, you have to decide, okay, I am exclusively going to talk to our offspring in this language, and you are exclusively going to talk to them in the other language. And it's going to be, this is what we plan to do for sure for the first 5 years of their lives, but honestly, you should probably do it for the rest of their life. And I would like to argue, if you're going to do one parent, one language, that you require that the child respond to you in the language in which they were addressed. And that will help to prevent some of the problems I'm going to mention in a second. If you can do that from the time the baby is little, they will grow to become what we call a balanced bilingual. where they have equal access to both of their languages. One thing that concerns parents is that when the child gets to be about 4 or 5 years old, they'll start to display what's called speech mixing, where let's say, somebody who only speaks one of the languages addresses them, not their parent, but somebody else who only knows one of the languages addresses them. The child may respond in a sentence that contains words from both languages so that the person that they're talking to has absolutely no idea what this child's talking about. It's like this mixture of words. And the reason why they do it is because they're going to utter whatever word comes to mind first, and not without a lot of concern about who they're talking to. Usually by the age of about 5, they'll start to sort that out, and they'll realize I have to respond in the language that I was addressed. And so if somebody addresses them in, let's say, English, they will respond exclusively in English. Let's say their second language is Spanish, they'll respond exclusively in Spanish, because they start to figure out context matters. So whatever the other person starts with, I will respond in. You may see speech mixing in bilinguals for their whole lives, though, especially when they're talking to other bilinguals. Because, again, they'll utter whatever word comes to mind fastest, and if they know that the other person's bilingual too, they don't have to inhibit that. They can just go. They know that the other person speaks both languages, so they will, flawlessly and fluently just switch back and forth, and oftentimes not even notice that part of the words were in one language and part were in the other. And the speaker won't even notice that they did it, because it's just whatever's coming out of my mouth fastest. And that's a really nice place to be, where you have another person who you can just speak quickly and fluently, and they're going to understand no matter whether the words are all in one language or not. So you might see speech mixing the whole life. What I was studying in my PhD training was whether that's a deficit, whether it actually slows down cognition and actually causes a person who knows 2 languages to have to sort of stop and think for a second. What we were doing was making them hop back and forth between their 2 languages randomly among the trials. So they might have 3 prompts in a row to answer in English, and then they'll hit a prompt that they're supposed to answer in Spanish, and then, because we had all Spanish-English bilinguals in this research. And so we found that when they didn't know on any given trial what they were going to be prompted with, and particularly if they'd been prompted for several trials in a row to be in one language and now it's switched, that code switching can take a bit of time. But guess how long? Measurable in milliseconds. So that in real life, most bilinguals don't describe having much trouble. And what we're talking about with balanced bilinguals is kids who learn so young that they've got equal fluency in both languages. They typically hop back and forth really quickly. So some of the social effects I wanted to address, though, if you have the great privilege of being able to raise a balanced bilingual child, a lot of times once they enter the school system, they start to get feedback from their peers that it's not normal to be able to speak 2 languages. That the children may not say anything like that, but the bilingual may hear it like that. Oh, I didn't know you could speak, another language. Oh, what did you say? I didn't understand it. Like, these kinds of questions might feel like, you're weird. Why are you talking like that to the person who's speaking in another language? They sometimes are embarrassed for their peers to meet their parent who typically addresses them in the other language. Even if their parent can speak the dominant language but has chosen, I'm only going to talk to my child in the other language, the child may be like embarrassed that their parent can speak this other language. And this is most common during the elementary school years. So, the latter part of the age bracket we're studying right now through, probably middle school would be really typical for kids to be embarrassed that their parents have this ability to speak in another language, or that they have this ability. And so a lot of times what kids will do is sort of repress their speaking of that language. And they may maintain what we call their ability to be a receptive bilingual. So you can speak to them in the other language and they understand you fine, but they can't produce. And they literally will say, I can't speak that language. And it's like, well, you were speaking it when you were 7. And so how can you not speak it now? But they've kind of like repressed all the grammar and all that stuff, and it doesn't come fluently to them anymore. The good news is that a lot of times when they get to college age or something, they start to recognize, actually, that was a pretty important skill I had. It's part of my identity now. I'm actually proud that my parents can speak 2 languages. Like now they've made this transition. They're like, dang it, I can't speak the language. So they'll enroll in introductory level classes in college or whatever on their language, and they very rapidly gain back their competence, and they are like, oh wait, I do know this language. We call that rapid relearning, where with just a little bit of training, it all starts coming back. It shows that it was still there. So that's good news on the bilingualism, that even if the child has this, very powerful motive to not be different from their peers, and they repress all this stuff, and you can't force them, you're like, I'm not going to act like I heard you until you speak in my language. Like, this can be quite the power struggle between a parent and a child. So a lot of times parents just give up. I had a friend, a really good close friend on the west side, who was Vietnamese. Her husband and her both fluent speakers of Vietnamese, fluent speakers of English. When they had kids, they were sending their kids to Vietnamese school, and part of it is about cultural stuff too. But she's like, well, I want them to be able to speak Vietnamese. And I said, have you considered doing, one parent, one child? This is the same friend I told you about who had the infant who would make themselves throw up if the food wasn't the correct temperature. So she had a complete infant, and I was like, you could completely do this right now with, your infant. Just speak. One of you speak English and one of you speak Vietnamese to the baby. And she's like, no, I don't want to have that be a thing between us where I'm forcing them to speak Vietnamese. I want them to go to school and have their peers around them. And I'm like, you know what? You make a good point. The bad part is that the children didn't start going to Vietnamese school till they were like 7 or 8 years old. And so the likelihood that they're balanced bilinguals is a lot lower. It would have been much better for their language acquisition if the parents had spoken one parent, one language from birth. That would have been much better for and then send them to Vietnamese school later, to really solidify it and cause them not to become receptive bilinguals in the long run. But a lot of times with parents, they don't want to get into these battles with their kids, and they want their kids to fit in, and they want, so it's sorry, my dog barked. So I can see their point, but I also can argue that it's not the greatest. All right, I'm going to stop here because apparently I have a barking dog anyway. So I'll see you guys in the next video.